Welcome to Now in the 90s, where we look at the game releases of 30 years ago today. This week, Kirby, as we know and love him today, The First Samurai, and the return of Batman Returns. I am your host, Jared, and today is May 5th, 1993. The original was the introduction, but it was the sequel that defined him. Released in May 1993, was Kirby's Adventure for the NES. Kirby's Adventure is a side-scrolling action platformer. Guide Kirby through a variety of worlds while running, jumping, and puffing up to float. Kirby can still inhale objects and enemies and spit them back out to attack, but it was Kirby's Adventure on NES that introduced Kirby's copy ability. By inhaling and swallowing certain enemies, Kirby will acquire their powers to use all new attacks. These abilities include things like sword, cutter, hammer, stone, UFO, and ball. Take down now iconic bosses at the end of each world and earn extra lives through a handful of mini-games. Kirby's Adventure is the direct sequel to 1992's Kirby's Dream Land for the Game Boy. It started development when Nintendo asked development studio HAL Laboratories and director Masahiro Sakurai to port Kirby's Dream Land from the Game Boy to the NES. Since the original game received criticisms for being too simplistic, Sakurai instead opted to create an all-new game. Even early on, it was believed that it was going to be just a port. Issue 46 of Electronic Gaming Monthly had a brief preview of Kirby's Adventure, and even then they listed it as an enhanced port of the Game Boy game. It's 1993. The NES was already 8 years old, and the Famicom 10 years old. By this point, developers were incredibly experienced with optimizing the system to its fullest. This allowed HAL Laboratories to create a visually impressive game with fantastic music, great animations, and impressive backgrounds. Seriously, that rotating tower part of that one butter building stage was always one of my favorites. There's a reason that Kirby's Adventure is the second biggest NES game ever made with a 6 megabit cartridge. In case you're wondering, the first biggest is Metal Slater Glory at 8 megabits, also from HAL Laboratories and only on the Famicom. It's possible that Kirby's Adventure was originally meant to have been ported multiple times. Issue 47 of Electronic Gaming Monthly gave a full preview based on Kirby's appearance at the Consumer Electronics Show. In it, they state that Kirby's Adventure would be a hit for the NES and, quote, soon the Super NES. Even one of the reviewers in the same issue stated excitement for the upcoming SNES version. It's possible it was a misquote from some Nintendo representative at the show, or some original plans that got shuffled away. Still, it was another new game for a fresh IP from Nintendo, and they were more than happy to promote it as much as possible.
Who's Kirby? Behind the flabby facade, a physical powerhouse, a street fighter, a weapons expert. He's whatever the situation demands. In Kirby's Adventure, evil King Dedede's stolen Dreamland's dreams. Now Kirby's fighting to get him back, level by nightmarish level. That's Kirby. He's cute. Till you cross him, then he's one tough cream puff. Kirby's Adventure on NES.
Also, if you go back and watch that TV ad again, they definitely said King Dedede and not King DDD. So, just pointing out that mistake. In addition to the television commercial, Nintendo Power issue 48 gave Kirby an 8-page preview and walkthrough. When it was finally released, Kirby's Adventure received lots of praise and love, but it did get some weird criticisms, like how the game is slightly too easy, or that all the game character sprites are just too small on the screen. Electronic Gaming Monthly reviewed it with an average score of an 8.25 out of 10. And Nintendo Power awarded it an average score of a 3.75 out of 5. But I also want to point out that Kirby got a lower score from them than the Incredible Crash Dummies game for NES. Kirby's Adventure was a massive success. It went on to sell over 1.7 million copies, quickly becoming a new Nintendo staple. It's thanks to Kirby's Adventure that his copy abilities were cemented in the series' legacy, eventually giving us dozens of new Kirby games and a Kirby cartoon. Kirby's Adventure has been ported to numerous Nintendo consoles and online virtual console services like the Nintendo Switch. It was remade into 3D for the Nintendo 3DS Classics, and it got remade entirely as Kirby's Nightmare in Dream World for the Game Boy Advance in 2002. We had one Batman, yes, but what about second Batman? Released in May 1993, was Batman Returns for the Sega CD. Batman Returns is a side-scrolling action platformer where you play as the Batman. Run, jump, and attack enemies to deliver some street justice. Use various gadgets for more attacks or to reach other platforms. Make your way through each level and fight iconic villain bosses at the end of the stages. In addition to all of this, there's Batmobile driving segments where Batman shoots everyone else with frisbees and missiles made with non-lethal fiery explosions. Batman Returns for the Sega CD is a port of the Batman Returns game for the Sega Genesis, which originally released in October 1992 and is based on the 1992 Batman Returns movie. It's an entirely separate game from the Super NES Batman Returns from Konami that we covered just a couple weeks ago. The Sega Genesis version of Batman Returns was bad. It had confusing level layout, muted, ugly graphics, unfair difficulty, and hit detection that is questionable at best. Batman Returns on the Sega CD is also still bad. Nothing was adjusted, fixed, or tweaked from the Genesis port. However, the music was greatly improved thanks to completely redone music using the CD hardware. The original game used the Sega Gems sound driver, which sounds bad in every game it's used in, so the new music was a vast improvement. Also all new was the driving sections. The Sega CD library was basically filled with ports of Genesis games or games with full motion video. The Batmobile segments aren't just tacked on bonus stages, it's an all-new engine that uses the Sega CD hardware properly. Fast action, impressive sprite scaling, awesome music, great controls. It was everything that could redeem the repackaged game. There's even a level where he plays the Bat ski boat from the movie. There's a reason why all the advertisements for Batman Returns on Sega CD focused solely on these exciting new driving sequences. These weren't just a reason to buy the game on its own. For its time, they were considered the showcase piece of the Sega CD hardware. People would use Batman Returns driving levels to show off how cool the Sega CD was. In fact, in the options menu of the game itself, you can set it to only play the driving levels, or just the platforming levels if you hate yourself. Was the vehicle section strong enough to save it? Nope, not really. Batman Returns still reviewed poorly when it came out. Electronic Gaming Monthly awarded it with an average score of a 5.25 out of 10, praising the Batmobile parts but loathing the Genesis holdovers. GamePro magazine also stated in their review that the poor control, so-so graphics, and limited new levels makes Batman a big disappointment. But still scored it with a 3.5 out of 5? Reviews used to make no sense at the time. One of those SNES games you've probably seen the box of, but likely never played. Also released this week in 1993, was The First Samurai. The First Samurai is a side-scrolling action game. Play as the First Samurai and swing your katana around to defeat all kinds of enemies. Take too much damage though and you'll lose your sword, forcing you to use your fists until you get it back. Use special bells to open new paths in the level, get to the end of each stage, and then fight a massive boss. The First Samurai was put on the Super Nintendo by Kemco and was originally an Amiga game first released in September 1991. Once you realize that it was made for computers like the Amiga and Commodore 64, everything about the game makes way more sense, from the way it looks to the way it plays. It only kind of explains some of the weird sound effects it uses. Hearing your guy shout, "My sword," when you get it back is fine, but having health restoring food accompanied with hallelujahs is out of place. Who do you think you are? Toe Jam and Earl? The SNES version of the port was also heavily censored from the original. Small things like the Coca-Cola and burger health items were removed, all blood from the intro screens were removed, and all human enemies were changed into demons. First Samurai went well under the radar of pretty much everyone. It was one of those games that was always available for rent at the video store, and it didn't get a whole lot of advertising. It also barely got reviewed. The only review we could find for the Super Nintendo version was from GamePro magazine, who reviewed it with lots of 4s out of 5. The First Samurai did get a sequel, but it was only released in Europe. Aptly titled The Second Samurai, it had the same developer and was published by Psygnosis, and was for the Sega Mega Drive. There was a planned Sega CD version of that, which got canceled, but it does have 2-player co-op. Perhaps more surprising, The First Samurai was going to be rebooted for the Nintendo 64. Announced in August of 1998, the original developer, Vivid Image, said they're bringing it to 3D space, focusing on exploration action, just like that hot new Tomb Raider series. And when you get into a fight, it plays like a one-on-one fighter inspired by Tekken. First Samurai 64 was planned for a 1999 release, but there was never any release previews, images, video, or anything, effectively becoming vaporware. And as for everything else this week, here's Editor Dylan.
Hey, did you catch the episode of Saturday Night Live last week? 45 years ago? Well, they made a platformer about it 30 years ago called The Blues Brothers for the SNES. I've never seen it or the movies, so I'll have to improvise. Two music-obsessed blues brothers, I'll name them Lucky and Gorgeous, tried to collect every record on the planet. After a life of mundane mediocrity, they decided to strive for a more fulfilling career and formed the Runaway Five, a band who would tour their music to adoring fans all across the nation. More importantly, they vowed to only appear in good games from then on. To be continued. In a couple years. Impromptu Japanese lesson. Kakomanaito roughly translates to must surround, which should lower the amount of people who ask, what the hell is a Kakomanite in Busyland for the SNES? It's an action platformer where you must surround a percentage of a picture with some chalk. Get it? It's very anime, very niche, very hard to remember the title, and I am very confident that this is the first time you've ever heard about it. But it's not bad, give it a shot. Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves for the Game Boy is a port of the NES original based on the movies starring Kevin Costner. From what I could tell, it's a puzzle game where you search for keys and trapdoors to escape. No wait, it's a side-scrolling hack and slash. No wait, it's a top-down action-adventure game. No wait, it's a real-time tactical RPG. No wait! Say what you want about the visuals, which I will. They look like a blurry JPEG of Bigfoot being violently yanked out of a printer as it's still printing. But this game's got variety. I didn't think I'd enjoy it, but it kept me engaged by constantly tossing new mechanics at me. Another welcome surprise. Something I won't say about this next game. American Gladiators on the Genesis. It's just like the version we already covered in our March 31st, 1993 episode. If you haven't seen it, give it a watch. If you have seen it, give it a watch. Maybe you'll find the hidden Steam code. Batman isn't the only game on the Sega CD this week. We also got Final Fight CD, the definitive version to play at home in 1993. The SNES version doesn't even come close. Better graphics, CD quality music, more opponents on screen, extra content, levels, even voice acting. But the best addition of all? Two-player co-op. Too bad I don't have any friends. The final game this week is for the TurboGrafx CD, titled Lords of Thunder. That sounds metal as hell, so I'm gonna be disappointed if it doesn't have a soundtrack to back it up. Oh, it's backed up in triplicate on multiple externals and cloud storage. Of all the games we covered on this show, this is the one that gave me FOMO. So let's see how much it's going for. Oh, okay, well, it's on that Turbo Mini that released a bit ago, so I'll just... Oh. RetroArch it is then. 9 games released on these 5 consoles this week in 1993. Of course Lords of Thunder would be this week's biggest value gainer. I have a feeling anyone who says emulation is wrong never had to decide whether they wanted to eat or pay rent. Happy Cinco de Mayo!
Thank you, Dylan. In the collector's corner, Kirby is still okay despite selling almost 2 million copies. It released with a budget price of $39.99, and now the game alone is $30. The box and manual brings it up to $95. Compared to the other versions of Batman Returns, the Sega CD one isn't particularly valuable. It had a selling price of $49.99, and now just the game disc is $25. With the case and instruction manual, it's worth $75. First Samurai isn't exactly super desired either. It's easy to find the game alone for about $32, and a complete one for $110. And that's it for today. Next week, 52 games in one, Alpha Strike that Atlas's PPCs, and... what could possibly go wrong? I'm your host, Jared, and this was Now in the 90s. Thank you so much for watching Now in the 90s. I want to thank some patrons like Albin Handberg and Urban Skirk. Please like the video and leave a comment down below, and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you already are a subscriber, thank you so much for watching this show every single Friday. Do you remember when you got Kirby's Adventure? I do. It was actually Christmas of 1993. My brother got this game, and I got a Super Nintendo game, and even as a kid, I was so confused why I was getting SNES games, and he was getting an all-new NES game.